Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. I will cover the countries of the world, the states of the United States, and the counties of California in 3 sections of approximately 15 to 20 minutes each. In practice, I tend to bust through those restrictions, but I almost always do them in that order. So countries, then states, and then the cities. Countries. So let's start with the countries. As usual, over the months that I've done this, I have gradually honed my graphs, starting from graphs that were a little more traditional. Actually, I don't know that I ever really had the traditional graphs of total number of cases for the state of Illinois. But I started with daily cases by population, which I thought was important, adjusted by population, my DCPM metric, daily cases per million. And then I also, from the very beginning, was doing growth charts. What's the change in the daily cases? And recently, I've been using my severity graph a lot, and I'm liking this graph pretty well. It combines those two. It includes an aspect of daily cases per million, and it also includes an aspect of weekly growth. So when a country has a very large number of cases every day, adjusted for population, it has a higher severity. When it has a low number of cases, it has a lower severity. When it has a high weekly growth rate, it has a higher severity. When it has low weekly growth rate, it has a lower weekly severity. And so this metric combines those two in what is almost good enough for me to just show this and say, that's my news. But I tend to go into at least the growth rates and some of the other statistics as well, other metrics. But what's the news? Well, 200 in daily cases per million. I'm going to put on my awesome glasses. 200 in daily cases per million is what I consider to be a hot spot in severity. And this is looking, as we'll see, relative to, say, the counties of California or the states of the United States. The countries of the world are looking good, relatively good. We're still in a pandemic, but we have very few severity hotspots in the world. These are all the countries in the world. These are the top ones in severity. The only really bad ones we've got are Peru, Brazil, Colombia, and Panama. Again, that Central South America cluster, which really just doesn't seem to be getting a lot better. Brazil sometimes seems like it's going to be getting better, but not yet. It's over 200. But as we've seen, 400, or if we go way out, well, that's kind of crazy. But something like Bahrain, which got to a severity of 600, or Kuwait, which got to 500, or I guess those old ones don't count. Where is, oh wow, Qatar, which was just news every week forever, has dropped off our severity graph entirely. But when it was here, it was severity, I think, in the 800s or maybe even thousands. All these worst states or worst countries have gotten better. All of them are no longer, all the ones you see here are no longer severity hotspots. Some of them, however, many of them are still warm. There's still severity warm spots. All the rest of this list you can see here pretty much is 100, over 100 or pretty close to it. So the world has a problem, but it's not as bad as a problem as it's had. And overall, the United States has a worse problem than the world does, as we'll see in our next section. The United States has a lot of severity hotspots. I believe the top 20 of states are all severity hotspots. And we can compare states and countries thanks to the way that I've designed my metrics so they adjust for population, and because the growth ratio already cancels out the population. So these metrics really can be compared. Say, how is Brazil doing versus New York? Well, New York's doing great, Brazil's doing terribly, but some of the states of the United States are actually a lot worse, or at least a little worse, I think, than Brazil. But one thing we don't see here is anything in the thousands anymore, so that's nice. A lot of countries are in pretty bad shape, but no one in really, really terrible shape. So that's kind of the news. I will say there isn't a trend here upwards or downwards overall, I wouldn't say, just eyeballing it. Certainly there's a trend that the worst countries, these few, have gotten a lot better and are trending downwards, but there are plenty that seem to be willing to take their place. Peru right now is the worst of all, with a severity approaching 300. It's in very bad shape. And again, the four worst are all in Central South America, but they're not in the United States. They're not the United States. The United States is one of those countries that was worse and has gotten a lot better. And since we talk for two-thirds of our segments about the United States, worth taking a close look at it. The United States certainly became a hotspot in early July. It peaked in severity in July 21st, and it has been getting better ever since, and it is no longer a severity hotspot. Trending downward at a leisurely pace. We've seen a lot faster downward trends, but how long did it take it to get from 254 or 250? Actually, it doesn't matter. This isn't the graph where it really matters when it'll cross zero. We'll see later, but just to say, the United States is getting better and is no longer a severity hotspot. I will show the growth. Another thing that I often like to focus on when we look at countries is what is the growth rate, especially of the 20 worst countries. Now, when you look at growth rates, this does seem to me to have a better than horizontal trend. Obviously, there were a lot of countries that were pretty bad back in the day. They were over 80%. I think of 40% as a growth hotspot, maybe 35% if you want to match it up to what I used to say about weekly growth or daily growth. But 40% a week, roughly, growth hotspot. We had several of those in July and mid-July. 5, 6, 7 of these countries were growth hotspots, growing weekly at over 40%. Some of them a whole lot over 40%. Some of them over 80%. Those have all recovered with all of them have recovered to well below 40%. In fact, there are no of the hottest countries in the world in daily cases per million. In other words, the countries that have the worst cases right now, have the most cases right now. All of them, none of them are hot. None of them are growing hotly. They are all, in fact, mostly shrinking slightly in their daily growth. Now, you see this thicker white line, horizontal line here. That's the zero line. Anything below zero is right now shrinking. I've made a lot of claims in this series based on graphs like this one, Costa Rica, where I can say, look, it was high. It's still growing at 4%, but see how it's headed downward, so eventually it's going to turn the corner and everything will be fine. It will start to shrink. Those claims can certainly still be made, but we don't have to make them for all these countries. These countries, we don't have to say someday they're going to stop growing. All these countries have stopped growing. If they, they've all stopped growing and they're all below the zero line. Their growth is negative. They're all seeing fewer and fewer daily cases per million. And that's more than half of them, I think. What do we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 maybe? 9 possibly above the line. 9 countries that are still growing of the worst hit ones. And that means about 12 of them are shrinking. So then that's a pretty good trend for the world, as for the countries of the world as a whole. And of these, the ones that are above, there are quite a lot, like I pointed out, Costa Rica, that are shrinking. Another Central South America country, Dominican Republic. There's a real theme here, Brazil, but those 3 at least show a slight or significant downward trend in their growth rate. Brazil is kind of horizontal. It can never decide whether to recover or not, but in the very short term, it's showing a slight downward trend. In the long term, it's more horizontal. In the medium term, it had recovered, it seemed like. It had a negative growth rate, and now it's lost it again. And it's back up to 11% weekly growth, which historically in this pandemic is not a big deal. We've seen so much worse than that, but still, 11% weekly growth means you're seeing more and more cases. So all of these have got to get their numbers down below zero before we can really be happy about them. Here's one, Puerto Rico. Yeah, again, Puerto Rico, for some reason appearing as a country, is shrinking. It was one of the worst. It's another really part of the Central South America cluster, I'd say. And Argentina, Yeah, Peru, Kosovo, and then randomly have Kosovo. But there's a real trend here, there's a real cluster here that Central South America is not doing well. It's the worst in the world. And these are the, not just Severity, which was our first one, but these are also the hottest country in daily cases per million. So these are the 20 countries that have the most cases adjusted for population. And we see a lot of them in Central South America. If we went through that list, I think we'd find half of them of the list are Central South America, including the worst ones, like Peru and not Kosovo, and Colombia and Puerto Rico, Argentina. So the news is similar to how it's been. Central South America is still hard hit. There's some indication of recovery there, but not always. Peru is certainly not recovering. Peru really alone among this graph, though we might claim that Kosovo kind of fits it as well. Peru has the three characteristics we really hate to see, which is a lot of cases, which because it's in this top 20 to begin with, a positive growth rate, not super high at 25, but positive, and an upward trend of its growth rate, an acceleration of the growth rate. So back in the day, we used to find a lot of these countries. Now, all we've got that has those three are Peru and Kosovo even seems to have maybe peaked and be turning downward, which might leave Peru alone as one of the really problem spots that has those three characteristics. Since there's just not much to say about countries, let's see if we can find something interesting to talk about for a few more minutes. Something I don't normally talk about is death rates. Deaths per million, similar, the DDPM metric, similar to the DCPM, but in deaths rather than reported cases. The nice thing about DDPM is that we presume that countries really do report deaths when they occur. And they know when people have died. Those are both debatable presumptions for sure, but let's just go with that. Countries report deaths when they occur, and countries know when deaths have occurred. I think that the latter is even more likely. Countries really do know when deaths have occurred. And I'd say my generally optimistic mindset is that countries do tend to report. The health ministries of countries are interested in providing accurate data to the world. There may be some political resistance to that, but nevertheless, there is a strong intention of the scientists of the world to report, to make sure that the data is out there so that all the countries can react appropriately. And so here's the daily deaths per million, subject to the caveats implied in the previous paragraph. We can see, it's hard to say really what this graph shows us actually. Peru had extraordinarily high death rate. Is it rising? Is it falling? This is again I think this is the top 20 deaths. The label of this graph is a little bit ambiguous about whether it means top 20 DCPM, which is what I often do, but surely this is top 20 DDPM, top 20 countries in daily deaths per million. We've only just added this graph. I don't have a kind of natural knack yet for knowing what's good and what's bad, the way I can label things as hot spots or warm spots on the other graphs. So all I can really say at this point is I'll start throwing out numbers, and maybe eventually I'll figure out what's good and what's bad. Worth looking at the United States, though. The United States, actually, before we look at the United States, note the worst is Peru with 14 DDPM. Kyrgyzstan had this spike that maybe wasn't real of deaths. It might have been something about reporting, but it's down into the main pack again, so I'm kind of going to ignore it. Chile, probably more real. There is an odd plateau and sudden spike from 6 to 14 in Peru. Don't know what that's about. One of the reasons they don't report deaths is because I feel like cases, even though the countries know about deaths, they don't necessarily, it seems like there are delays and there are more weirdnesses in the data and the deaths data, things like that plateau or this plateau here for Chile. But we can, I think, fairly say that as we point at things and keep seeing over and over Central South America, that Central South America really does have a problem. It's not just, for instance, that they're suddenly testing a whole lot more, or that they weren't reporting tests before and now they are. we have a separate metric here, deaths, that really points to Central South America and to some degree the United States, which is very prominent, at least in April, as a problem. They have Chile and well, Kyrgyzstan is not in Central South America, but again, it's a weird blip. Bolivia, Panama, Colombia, Kosovo. There we see again, Kosovo is really rising as a weird spot. I'm just going to make sure my understanding of where and what Kosovo is correct. I believe them to be roughly Europe. Yeah, I think of Kosovo as kind of probably one of the former Soviet republics, but I don't claim to know my geography that well. But yes, it's in Europe anyway, roughly, in the southeastern Europe. So not part of Central South America, but Kosovo keeps showing up. Showed up in cases, shows up here. Something's going on in Kosovo. Let's look at it quickly. And it's pretty alarming. They didn't even apparently report deaths until recently, or at least ourworldindata.org didn't have their reports of deaths. But look at that. If it really was down at 1 daily deaths per million, it's quintupled or sextupled in the past few weeks, month. Something is going on in Kosovo, and we'll keep a close eye on that. But it is rising. It is a rising hotspot in at least the two metrics we've looked at. South Africa also looking a little bit problematic, and then there's Chile again. I will look at, and again, I think if we were to look, I'm not going to dive in here, but a lot of these are Central South America. Worth noting that Mexico, which I don't think really showed up in the cases graph, is nevertheless showing up in the deaths graph. And this is the sort of thing that I won't quite say it's the conspiratorially minded, but at least those who have various reasons about why the cases numbers are inaccurate do tend to believe the deaths numbers more. And so it may be that Mexico has done a poor job of reporting its cases, but nevertheless is willing to or able to report its deaths. And so here we see a real rise of deaths, again, a quintupling of deaths in Mexico. But that seems to have peaked in July, in early July, and since then it seems to be stable. So hopefully Mexico, it hasn't turned downward yet, but hopefully it's looking better. And then there's the United States. I've harped on this a bit, so I'm going to just spend 30 seconds on it, which is to say there was a period where deaths were dropping and cases were rising, and people were saying, oh, there's not really a problem in the United States because look at how good the deaths look. They were at 7, a very high number. Now they're at 2, a pretty good number, DDPM. No one else uses DDPM except me. I think they all should, but adjusted for population, 7 down to 2. But then, as I was saying back in the day, a few weeks ago, we can expect deaths to rise if cases really have been rising, if there really is a problem. And deaths in the United States indeed are rising. There's no sense in this, from this graph, eyeballing this graph, that they are peaking at this point. So deaths are rising, but deaths do lag cases. So if we go back to the daily case, I'm using my legend here just so I can find it quickly, hopefully. We go back to the daily cases per million. How's the United States doing in daily cases per million? Well, better. This is still a pretty early sign of recovery. Too early to say much about it, but I will say that the United States only briefly crossed over into hotspot territory and shows a pretty solid now arc toward recovery. And we called that weeks, even hereabouts, I think we were starting to be able to see the United States was going to peak from our growth rate graph. And it's peaked and it's falling, and I'm guessing it'll keep doing that, but who knows? That's just a guess. But we can see that the United States cases, which were going up and up and up, peaked and fell, and we can predict, I will predict, that in deaths per million, DDPM, we're going to see the same shape of the curve. Deaths per million is roughly proportional to cases. It tends to be offset by a few weeks. There are factors that change the factor or the constant of proportionality. The constant of proportionality is not constant, which is to say sometimes depending on factors like improved treatments, we may see that these graphs diverge a little bit in where it used to be we had a 0.1% mortality rate. Maybe now we have a 0.5% mortality rate. But nevertheless, when cases rise, deaths do rise. And so this is cases rising, deaths rising, and now we see cases peaking, and we can expect deaths to peak. Okay, let's move on to the states of the United States. Actually, I have this baked right here in this next tab. I'm going to head back to my live stream just to see if anyone is asking any questions. There are no questions in the live stream. So, moving on to the states of the United States. I do this as a live stream, by the way, mostly just because it's easier for me. Back in the day, I used to record it, and then I'd edit it, and then I'd have to synchronize the sound and put little transitions in. None of that for me now. I just do a live stream. Not many people listen to the live stream, but a fair number of people do tune into the videos later on YouTube. You can too, if you happen to be listening to this live stream, but want to watch another one at a time that's easier for you. You can always come to see these live streams on YouTube. They're all there. You can even go back to the history where I've made predictions and see, have they come true? They usually have. So, severity again, my favorite. I could almost do a live stream that never did anything but severity, because this really does encapsulate, I think, the most important parts of the curve or of the trend. So looking quickly at severity, I'm going to zoom in on the recent. I may zoom in further than this, but maybe not. And of course, all these graphs are available on gregfarrar.us, my website. You can go and browse through them yourself, especially if you're looking for something that's not in the top 20. Lately, I have been focusing on the top 20. And so there are other graphs, this one in particular, that show all the states. And you can go focus in on your favorite state, even if it's not as hard hit enough to be in the top 20 in severity. So, Mississippi and Missouri are on my mind. They seem to have been pretty, almost the worst for a while, and Mississippi is still the worst, though we can see the severity dropping sharply. Mississippi really very bad. And stepping back again, recall that there were very few countries. There were few countries over 200 in severity in the top 20 worst. There were very few countries over 200. And the top 20 are pretty much all in the 100 range, 100 to 200 range. Compare that to states, we see that the United States, this is another way of saying the United States is one of the worst hit countries in the world. The United States is, you can see, is clustered around 300, maybe 300 in severity for the top 20 states. It has a lot of severely hit states, a lot of hot spots. There, as we go by, as the days go by, and I keep doing this series, I keep saying pretty much everyone's over 200 of the top 20. That's becoming less and less true as more and more states start to dip below, and even substantially below, in the case of North Carolina, for instance, or Alaska, which was really, is this Alaska? Where's Alaska? Alaska had quite a spike there. Rose up to almost 500, recovered down now into warm spot territory. So you can see this cluster of states down here that are all only warm. I'll zoom in on them just briefly. I'll zoom in on the sort of warm to hot range so we can see what it looks like. There are a number of top 20 states now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think. 6 states of the top 20 are no longer severity hotspots, though it looks like Nebraska might be heading back into that area. But there's Alaska. No, there's California, actually. California is no longer a severity hotspot. Alaska is the one way down here, which really isn't a severity hotspot at 160. California has been trending very nicely downward. It's this sort of, I don't know what color this is, gray maybe line, trending downward. It was 300 in late July, and now look, California is a mere 196. California is no longer a severity hotspot. It's just getting better. We'll see a little bit more, and then in the next section we'll break it down by county, why that is. Kentucky, yeah. But if you look at these, you see there's certainly, actually I'll zoom back out again and then zoom in on the short-term picture. When I look at this graph, I definitely see a trend downward. There are exceptions, but Hawaii being a serious exception. Hawaii, which was doing so well, they banned all their tourists, or at least tried to make them stay in their hotels, but there's poor Hawaii. In my Medium blog post, Medium article, Medium story, I did say Hawaii and a couple of 3 other states that hadn't been hit hard yet might form their own tiny final wave. This wave isn't very tiny for Hawaii. It's severe, but since Hawaii itself is small and the other 3 states are small, Hawaii is not going to affect the total numbers very much. Nevertheless, Hawaii is one of the top 20 now and really looks worse than anyone else. It's the worst of the top 20 in severity, keeping in mind that the population is small and therefore it's not going to affect the United States numbers. If there were one state that I wouldn't want to live in right now, it would be Hawaii. Well, I don't know. There are other reasons to live in Hawaii, but for purely epidemiological reasons, I recommend not living in Hawaii for the next 30 days. And again, we've seen over and over that 30 days is all it takes for a state to peak, for it to go away, and generally not to return. Maybe I'll take a look at that graph again, because I've gotten a lot of pushback on that not return thesis. My thesis, again, speculative, but I think supported by the data here, is that states that get warm, this is the DCPM graph I'm really talking about, but severity graph is correlated. When they get warm, they go as high as they want to go, which can be very high, peak in about 30 days after they got warm. They recover at a little slower than they went up, and then they hit 0, drop below 0, and if they get all the way below, drop to 100, I mean, if they get all the way below 100 DCPM, they don't come back. They do not have a second wave. That's what I have generally been seeing here. And from this, we can look hopefully at states like Florida. Well, maybe you don't look hopefully at Florida. That's not actually a great graph. We'll look at it in the DCM graph and see if Florida really is losing its mojo as it seems to. Or Louisiana is more, is doing better. I mean, Louisiana is still terrible at 300, 400 severity. It's still very hot, but it's showing this trend of a month to the peak, a month to the bottom, and out. Then you're done. Will there be additional waves in states? I kind of think not. I think each state has its wave and then it's done. But that is a very controversial thesis, so certainly don't take off your masks because of it. The reason we've gotten here, may I emphasize again, the reason that we have these downward trends, I believe, is because, the data doesn't show this, but I think that some of the science shows this, is because of the many things that we've done to reduce transmission. And those include masking, they include physical distancing, they include lockdowns, they include all the different ways that we're not allowed to go and do things in groups that we used to be able to do. That's, I think, why these are going downward. And so I would be very sad if people looked at these graphs and said, oh, things are okay, I can go do all the things I used to do. No, not yet. Maybe when there's a vaccine, or maybe when you get to New York's level. Look at New York. New York is an example of someone who might be able to think think in those terms of, okay, we can, for instance, reopen schools, as Governor Cuomo said. Severity was very high. It doesn't go all the way back to the beginning. New York actually was even worse, I think. But it just got better and better and better. And now New York has a severity of 32 or 30, and DCPM that I think is even lower. New York's looking great. New York can afford to take some luxuries with its social distancing and so on. And I think probably still best to have everyone wear masks, but because that seems to be one of the most effective things. And wash your hands, and you know the list. That list and the 90% of people who are following it is how New York has gotten to where it is, and why we see places like, even Mississippi, which is the worst, also seems to have shown a peak and appears to be recovering. Long-term trend still upward, so we'll see. It's hard to say. But anyway, I see a downward trend in severity. I see that most states, almost all of them, are angled downward here, and that's good news. But none of them are to 100. None of these top 20. They're all above 100. So these are all very severe. They all need to keep doing what they're doing to mitigate infection, to reduce infection rates. That's what's driving these numbers down, I believe. And until they're much lower than this, maybe 30, sure. If North Carolina gets to 30, it can think about really starting to relax a little bit. And by the way, there's a way that when all the states are really severe, it's hard for any of them to come back down because they cross-pollinate. And we saw this. Actually, let's just head over to the trajectories graph. This trajectories graph was the one of the centerpieces of my recent Medium article, where I argued that the United States was just about to peak and would not see another major wave. And by the way, in the long term, epidemiologists come down on me. I'm not an epidemiologist, or at least I'm not trained as one. But a few epidemiologists, or at least people who, I don't know, a few people have criticized my thesis that we're not going to have another wave, saying the data doesn't support it, first of all, and secondly, that pandemics always have another wave. So how is it possible we wouldn't have another wave? And we had another wave in the 1918 flu, for instance. And in I just finished listening to a 32-part series on the Black Death. It's a good bedtime material, by the way. I recommend it for anyone who wants to sleep well. Black Death, which I would point out again, has had a mortality rate of approximately 50%. Half of every person in Europe died of the Black Death when that swept through Europe, versus our current mortality rate, which I think is hundredth of that. I think it's 100th of that. 0.5% of everyone dies now with this one. So again, count your blessings that you don't live in the Middle Ages, 1350, first wave Black Death. Instead, we live in this very mild pandemic. Now, we have much higher standards of trying to protect human life, I think, than we had then. This is my theory anyway, and also we have a lot more ability to protect human life than we did with all the lockdowns and the extreme measures we've been taking. So the Black Death probably would not kill 50% of us if it happened now. Plus, it's bacterial, at least the bubonic one is, and we have antibiotics, and with very few exceptions, the bubonic is not. There's, I guess, one super strain that's resistant. Anyway, I digress. My point is, the reason that we won't have a second wave, if we don't, and I would not put any money on it, and certainly would not change your behavior based on this theory, just take hope from the theory that this won't have to last forever. The reason that I don't think we're going to have a second major wave in the United States is because we have vaccination. And that is the only reason. If we didn't have vaccination, we would absolutely have a second wave. Because we have vaccination, and because we have a majority of people willing to get vaccinated, I believe that our second wave will be mild. At least the second wave will not be at 500 dCPM like the first wave. It'll be at 200, or we might get some hot spots in whenever the second wave is. But if the second wave can hold off until 2021, which is plausible, then what would have been the second wave, then our vaccines will be in place, and we'll be able to relax. And if it rises anyway, we'll also have all the other testing infrastructure and so on to stomp it down before it gets as bad as this. But this was our first wave. This graph again starts at when each country gets warm in dCPM, when each state reaches 100 dCPM. This is where the graph starts. So there's no place here that's May 1st or August 1st. This is just whatever date it was that each state got warm. Where did they go from there? And what they did, almost without exception, is they rose to their peak in about 30 days. They dropped down, and you can see this really nicely here. Weren't even any warm spots at the 65-day mark. Everyone had dropped below 100, and generally they haven't come back. Now, there are a few exceptions to this. Louisiana is our classic exception, which at least I can say has peaked. If I want to argue that Louisiana isn't an exception, which is, you know, good old-fashioned cherry-picking pseudoscience, Louisiana had this little thing here, but it doesn't really count. It just doesn't count because it was too small and didn't have a chance to build up immunity. It never really got over it, and this is its first wave. I could argue that, and I do make somewhat similar arguments in other cases, but I don't really understand why Louisiana. I don't really like to make that argument about Louisiana. So Louisiana is really, to me, our counterexample. Now you can see Mississippi also trying to be a pretty strong counterexample. Mississippi, as we've mentioned, is in terrible shape right now. DCPM at 400, very, very hot spot. Probably peaked, but its peak was at 60 days, which is twice as long as most. And so it's certainly not going to follow this trend to drop down to here at the 65-day mark. If it follows any trend at all, it'll probably be 100 days before Mississippi's first wave peters out. But it's too soon to stay with Mississippi, but it certainly isn't behaving like the rest. It really got it hard, and it's just not, it just kept going. If we look at the whole graph of Mississippi, we can make a plausible exception for it by saying it didn't really get started until 20 days in. And so starting at 20 days in, peaking here is really only 40 days in. So these are the sorts of excuses we can make for those graphs that refuse to cooperate with my theory. I think that's a more solid excuse for Mississippi than it is for Louisiana. Louisiana is a real outlier. Mississippi, maybe not. Alabama's a little late to peak, but clearly headed downward. Arizona is just classic. It's following my theory classically to a T. It peaked right around 30 days, and it's been heading steadily downward, but a little slower. It'll hit the 0 mark, probably not as soon as some states. Higher peak maybe makes for a slower descent, longer descent. It's plausible, but it looks like it could hit the peak at 80 days. Anyway, we continue to see all these states doing the same thing. There are a few interesting stragglers here at the end, which I had to argue in my Medium article. Were not real second waves. First of all, they are very low. They're not severe. They're warm spots at most. Places like Maryland, interestingly, and Nebraska, which did have small peaks, and now they seem to be experiencing other small peaks. Why is that? Well, again, when this is today. The end of each line is today. So this is today, and this is today, and this is today. And I would say that when you have crazy stuff like this happening, all these the ends of the lines here, when you have so many states that are really hot right now, it's hard to stay recovered. There's transmission from between those compartments, between those states. There's transmission that happens inevitably at a higher level when there's another wave happening. So what I hope is happening here is just that these little waves are just, they're being pulled upwards by the very powerful long-standing waves in other very much harder hit states. If that's true, this is a testable hypothesis, and I do love a good testable hypothesis. If that's true, all of these will fade away when these fade away, and you can see them beginning to do that. Even maybe it's a little soon to say, but they're certainly not heading sharply upwards. But Nebraska here has a sense that it's peaked and is leveling. Maryland seems to maybe have plateaued. Delaware really seems to have plateaued. And then a couple of the lesser ones. Pennsylvania is not very hard hit. Or Michigan also had a slight wave, not even into warm spot territory, but it seems to have plateaued as well. So I expect, first of all, all of these to drop to 100 in a matter of weeks. Maybe not Mississippi, because Mississippi is really having a hard time of it. But again, Mississippi kind of belongs 20 to the left of here, so we'll see. At least it's not rising over the past couple of weeks. Mississippi seems to be showing us a pretty good indicator of recovery. And so does Louisiana, by the way, with its crazy second wave, also showing a pretty solid indicator of recovery. So I think all these are going to recover, as every wave of every state ever has. These are also going to recover because I think, I suspect, very speculative, but I suspect that these are only here because they got pulled there by these really high hot spots that we hadn't seen before, of a magnitude that we had not seen before, and then everyone will fade away. So looking at the growth charts, I'll just look at the short-term growth, and we can see the top 20 states, very good trend here on the growth charts. All of them headed downward, almost without exception. The hardest hit states, and here's that well, actually that's not Mississippi, this is Missouri. In terms of percentage, in terms of daily cases per million, Missouri is not super hot. It's right there in the middle of the legend, but it is the highest growth rate. But it too has dropped out of hotspot territory. Recall, 40% growth is hotspot in DCPM. It's out of hotspot territory and dropping like a rock. So at this rate, it's totally plausible that it will be, let's see, where was it? August 2nd to August 6th, 4 days, got it to here. 4 days, it's very plausible that 4 more days will have Mississippi turn the corner at that rate. It's dropping very quickly. And all of them are dropping, not necessarily so quickly, but they're dropping. And this has been going on for a long time. We've been talking about this for a long time, and you can see all these states below zero, all the states that are now shrinking. Not to remind you, having a graph like this doesn't mean that Missouri isn't seeing new cases. It's still growing at 25% a day. It's a relatively high growth rate, 25 per week, 25% a week growth rate. It's a pretty fast growth that it's still seeing, but its growth rate is dropping because back on July 30th it was growing at 55% a week, and now it's down to 25% a week. And if this trend continues, we can expect its growth rate to go to 0% a week. But for now, Missouri still has a big problem in that it's continuing to have more and more new cases every day. That's indicated by the end of this graph being above zero, above the thick white line. But all these states that have been gradually recovering are now in full recovery mode, where they are actually shrinking every day. All these states shrinking every day. Nevada, Louisiana, Alabama, Idaho, Texas, South Carolina, Arizona. Remember how terrible Arizona was? Well, they crossed zero back in mid-July, and they've stayed there. They've stayed at negative 10% growth every week, 10% fewer cases every week. Arizona's doing great. And Utah. Now, I'll look at briefly at the Gang of Six, which I'm not even sure they're all going to be here. Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas is gone from here. It's so good. Let's do it on this graph so we can actually see the Gang of Six. Gang of Six were, what was that? The hardest hit ones in May. Alabama's doing something strange here. Alabama, come on, graph, work with me here. Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas. Wow, it takes forever for me to click here. North Carolina, South Carolina, and Utah were the Gang of Six. And I use were advisedly because they are not anything anymore. North Carolina, South Carolina. I'm going to close some of my other tabs because we're just getting murdered here. I'm going to take a minute here. I think I've run my machine out of memory to the point that it's really going to become no, not really. All right, I'm going to close some tabs, some of my other COVID tabs. That means I'll need to reload when I switch over to counties. North Carolina, South Carolina, and Utah. So there's the Gang of Six. Now, if you remember, I used to show them on the different graph, on the rope chart graph, and this is much wigglier than that one. But if you remember, actually I'll just show them on the rope chart as well. One more time, for old time's sake, the Gang of Six: Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Utah. These were really bad. And then we started to see This was the first good news we got, really, from the United States. We started to see that they were turning southward. This was maybe in late June. And so they have. They continue. And now, as of today, according to the old style rope chart, every single one of the Gang of Six is shrinking daily. Some of them just barely. Alabama has been a problem, and it's waves all around, and I'm not sure that it'll keep that. But most of them are well into and this is daily percentages now, 4%, 2%, 1% drop in daily cases. The Gang of Six has turned the corner as a whole towards recovery. All right, I'm over time, as I often am, so I will just take another, before I head off to the counties, one more look at what I think is a very nice looking graph. I don't want this one, which is this graph. The worst hit states, where are they headed? They're headed into negative growth territory. Most of them have already gotten there. The others, without exception, I think, are all heading towards zero. So that's going to be a very good thing for the United States as a whole, for the U.S. numbers. I don't think did I show the U.S. growth numbers? U.S. growth numbers have been looking good for a while. U.S. has turned the corner and is now seeing negative growth in new cases. And this is why. The hardest hit states are all shrinking. At least their growth rates are shrinking. And half of them are shrinking in terms of daily cases. So good news on the state level. Still a lot of, there's still a pandemic going on. So again, what's to be done, as I ask in my Medium article, what do you do with this information? You don't change anything. That's what you do. The changes are all in your head, I recommend, from this information. What you get to do is you get to say, phew, we're not going to have to do this too much longer. We can actually see an end in sight. But you don't stop doing it now. So keep the good work. It's all your good work that has got us to this place. Keep it up until we're down into minuscule cases, until we have testing and contact tracing, so that every time something pops up, we stamp it flat. And that's what we're seeing in places like Australia. You know, they're suddenly stomping really hard, and that's because a little, it is very little, hotspot has risen for them, or a little mini epicenter has risen, but they are not going to let themselves go down that path, and I don't think any of our states will either, once we get it low enough that we can stop it. And so we have to take these draconian measures to get it low. Once we have, it'll be stomped out, and after that, we should be able to, through selective future action, stomp these things out quickly when they rise again. But for now, don't change anything. Keep doing the things. Now to the counties. The counties of California. I'm going to go through them quickly because I'm out of time pretty much. I'm going to mostly ignore the two crazy ones here, Marin and Kern. I don't believe them. There's probably a data anomaly. Maybe Kern had a really, really terrible problem for real, but if so, it's gotten over it. All right, I'm going to take another look at my activity monitor to figure out just why I'm having such slow responsiveness here. It probably is messing with my video as well. I can't imagine that the streaming thing can cope with something like this. OBS is using a huge percentage. It actually is the stream software that's using all my CPU. All right, I'm gonna make this quick because I have a feeling that my video is probably suffering. And in any case, I'm out of time. I'll just say that severity-wise, if I can actually get enough CPU here to draw a box. The counties of California are bad. We have a lot of very severe counties. Again, 200 is the mark of a severity hotspot, and almost all of the top 20 counties are severity hotspots. There are a lot of counties that aren't, but these are the worst 20, and they're all hot, and some of them are really, really hot. Even throwing out the two that were crazy, we still have Merced and Kings, which are still very hot. They have a ton of cases or growth rates that's very hot. Because my computer's acting up, I'm not going to dive into which of this is growth, how much of this is growth, and how much is daily cases per million. Or maybe I will, but I'm first going to say the nice thing here, the good thing about this graph is almost everything is trending downward. It looks a lot like the states of the United States. These are trending downward, so we see that though they're severe, they're getting slightly better. So that's at least something. And I am going to look at the growth graphs, because that, I think, might look even better. It has in the past. If we look at the growth graphs of the 20 worst counties, it looks a little bit like the states. We have a lot of those counties that are actually shrinking now. They're severe because they're very hard hit in number of cases, but they're shrinking by 10 or sometimes even 20% per week. And so we have several counties, 5 or 6 of them, 7 maybe, that are doing very well in terms of shrinking, and the rest are mostly trending downwards, especially these two, San Bernardino and Tulare, trending downwards and probably going to start shrinking soon. A few of them that are horizontal and aren't doing that well, but at least nobody has a 40% growth rate, which is the hot spot, except those 2 crazy ones, which are probably not real. The data probably is somehow weird, but even if it is real, you can see though they're at 40, they are sharply trending downward. Another reason to think that the data probably wasn't real. This green line will probably resume around the 30 mark, and it's just it's coming off a data spike and is probably going to end up at 30 or 20 pretty soon. And probably the same with Kern and Marin. Even if they are as bad as this graph says, they are trending downward very quickly in growth rate, and will pretty soon rejoin the pack. So that's the news for counties. It was not long ago, it was just as recently as July 24th here, or even the 25th, I guess, where none of the counties were shrinking. They were all growing. Now we can see that of the hottest ones, several are shrinking. Now a lot are still growing, and as we saw, a lot of them are still pretty severe, but we are seeing a trend where counties are shrinking. And when you look at all the counties together, we see that same trend. There are a lot of counties which back on July 21st, there were only a couple of strange outliers that were shrinking. Imperial, which really had its own special first wave. All the other counties in California were rising. Now we see that maybe a third of the counties are shrinking day over day in new cases. And probably, roughly, I would say, there are certainly exceptions. The trend is that most of the rest are heading towards the zero line and heading towards shrinking. So California is suffering from a serious epidemic right now. Don't change anything you're doing because of this graph, but take hope that it is a matter of just a few months, I think, until California can get to where New York got when it was in a similar case. 2-3 months, I think, is plausible where we can really start being able to change our behavior. It may not be time to open schools now, but in 3 months, I think that's something that might start to seem reasonable, because then we'll see. I'll do one more graph, daily cases per million graph, if my computer will cooperate. The daily cases per million graph, the other component of how bad things are. Right now, you see a lot of counties that are severely hit, above 20 in daily cases per million, and quite a lot that are probably above 100, roughly here. Now, if we, in 3 months, it's not really clear from here that they're trending downward. Obviously, Imperial is, but if the growth charts, which indicate a trend towards a decline of this chart, if they all go below 0, then we're going to see all of these lines squiggle downward towards 0, and eventually they're going to be at something like 30, which is where Imperial already is. Humboldt, that actually is. Never mind, Imperial is still pretty bad, but they'll head down where everyone is at 30, like New York is. And at that point, we can start saying, okay, we have such a low number of cases relative to the capacity of the healthcare system to handle new local hotspots, that we can safely go and start changing behavior. So again, don't change your behavior. It's not yet safe to change your behavior based on this information, but take hope I think there's a lot of hopeful information in this. This is not going to go on forever. This wave is only, it's probably just 2 or 3 months till it's really smashed flat if these trends continue. And by that time, around then, maybe we'll see another little wave around then before the vaccine arrives. But if there is a vaccine, which seems likely, not certain, but if there is a vaccine, and if you're all willing to take it, then I think we will not ever see this thing resurge in the way that it has in 2020. That's the news. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.